Welcome to Doctorates of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand. We're going to start today by asking you to forget everything you think you know about your own mind.
Mhm.
Specifically, forget about your deepest, darkest family drama. Because the philosophers we're diving into today argue that the core idea of the Oedipus complex is just a myth.
Right, and not just a harmless myth. They say it's a political tool.
A political tool that turns your unconscious not into this, source of raw creative power, but into a sterile theater of repetition.
That's the opening salvo, and it's from one of the most explosive texts of the 20th century. And the stakes here go far beyond just therapy sessions.
Oh, way beyond.
To put it a little dramatically, what if political and social revolutions aren't driven by, say, calculated economic planning or by following a neat party line?
Okay.
What if they're driven by an uncontrollable, spontaneous, almost subterranean outpouring of desire?
And that is the exhilarating and, frankly, vital territory we are charting today. We're embarking on a deep dive into Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's 1972 philosophical masterpiece, Anti-Oedipus.
It's a book that really emerged from political chaos.
It did. And at its core, it's an attempt to redefine the fundamental transformative forces that drive history itself.
So our mission is pretty ambitious. We need to deconstruct desire as a fundamental world-altering energy.
Right.
We are grappling with the core tension the authors identify.
Yeah.
This conflict between desire that is trapped, repetitive, and subject to repression.
Which they pin directly on the Oedipus complex.
Exactly. Versus desire that is liberated, transformative, and perpetually productive.
And crucially, this is not just some abstract theory you'd read in a university. The high stakes here are intensely practical and political.
Very much so.
D&G, as we'll call them, are attempting to define a realistic philosophical path toward a post-capitalist future.
They want to understand the true, hidden drivers of historical and political change. They're answering this pressing, immediate question of their time.
Which was?
Why do spontaneous, large-scale revolutions happen, and why do they so often go sour? Why do they collapse back into the same old hierarchies they tried to escape?
You really can't understand this book without the context. The historical catalyst for this radical collaboration is essential.
Absolutely. Deleuze and Guattari met shortly after the political earthquake of May 1968 in France.
An unbelievable time. Massive civil unrest, huge student protests, and these spontaneous general strikes on a scale that it shattered all the established political models.
And it wasn't just the government that was caught off guard.
No, the mainstream political left was stumped too. I mean, the French Communist Party, which operated under this very traditional Marxist framework.
Right, focused on organized labor, predictable economic cycles.
They utterly failed to predict or even account for the enormous, passionate outpouring of desire that animated the students and the workers.
The slogans, the street theater, the sheer drive for something else.
It wasn't rational economic planning. It was something else entirely.
It was clear to them that the traditional frameworks, whether you're talking psychoanalytic or Marxist, they just couldn't explain the emergence of desire as this spontaneous political force.
You couldn't explain this revolution without a new theory of desire.
A theory that didn't rely on party political power or predictable class struggle. It required a theory of how desire, as a raw material force, just flows and connects outside of all the established structures.
And that search for a new theory brings us to the core concept we absolutely have to tackle today.
The big one.
The line of flight, or in French, ligne de fuite. This is the central mechanism that connects their radical theory of desire directly to their theory of political and personal transformation.
It's a truly novel concept. It defines how desire operates when it is not inhibited, when it's not captured or turned against itself by all the repressive, structuring forces of social reality.
It's the escape route.
It is literally the escape route.
Okay, let's unpack this monumental philosophical and political intervention. And we have to start right where D&G start, with the destruction of the old guard. So we have to begin with what D&G saw as the great psychoanalytic betrayal. To build their positive theory of desire, they first had to, execute a surgical strike against the dominant paradigm of their time.
And that meant a brutal confrontation with the legacies of Freud and Jacques Lacan.
Exactly. Their core critique is that traditional psychoanalysis, in both its classical Freudian form and its later structuralist form, it takes the inherent spontaneous activity of unconscious desire.
And it subordinates it. It forces it to submit to some external social convention.
And that convention, that external template, is primarily enforced through the Oedipus complex.
Always Oedipus.
Now, they don't just throw Freud out entirely, do they?
No, not at all. They actually give him immense credit for a revolutionary discovery.
Which is?
The abstract category of desire itself. Specifically, they point to his later, more metaphysical works like The Unconscious and Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
Right.
They appreciate that Freud identified the true nature of unconscious desire, that it is exempt from mutual contradiction. It's timeless, and it's non-negating.
He captured desire as this active, productive, pre-personal, and profoundly energetic force.
Yes. It wasn't defined by what it lacked. It was defined by what it did.
Okay, so if that discovery was genius, where, in their view, did Freud go completely off the rails?
The cardinal error, what D&G call the political and theoretical disaster, was his act of generalization.
Meaning?
Freud took his own specific, historical, and familial situation, the nuclear family structure of his era, which they mockingly call his Goethean classical culture, and he universalized it.
He elevated this one specific historical convention into a universal, necessary myth of desire.
He completely reversed the order of determination, instead of recognizing that the social convention of the nuclear family creates Oedipal subjects.
That society molds desire.
Yes. Freud claimed the familial romance, the mother-father-child triangle, was the necessary and universal form that all desire must take, across all cultures, across all time.
And that's the moment, for D&G, where the unconscious just stops being a productive entity.
It's the moment of capture. By elevating Oedipus to this necessary internal form, Freud made desire inherently representative.
Or signifying.
Exactly. Desire was no longer seen as a raw material force building connections. It was just a fixed script being read out, interpreted through the lens of mommy and daddy.
And that is the root of their famous metaphor.
It is.
The unconscious stops being a factory, a workshop, constantly producing new connections and new flows.
And becomes just a theater, a scene, and its staging.
It becomes Oedipalized, neuroticized. It forces the infinite complexity of the unconscious into this closed, repetitive circuit of the family triangle.
And think about that factory metaphor for just a moment. If the unconscious is a factory, it should be busy producing things, right? Sensations, connections, reality.
But once it's a theater,
It's only capable of representing or reenacting the same few plays. Desire for the mother, fear of the father, guilt, repression. It stops being creative and just becomes repetitive.
it's a closed loop system, which is why neurosis feels so repetitive, right? You just keep running the same script.
Precisely. And this leads them directly to their critique of Lacan.
Who, at first, seemed like a step forward.
It really did. But he ultimately fell into the exact same trap.
Lacan, after all, was famous for challenging Freud's literal mythological interpretation of Oedipus.
Yeah, he said the complex was purely imaginary, a myth, not a real historical event like the primal horde story.
I think he called it a cock and bull story.
He did. He called it Darwinian buffoonery.
So that was the useful insight. Lacan understood that the Oedipal narrative only serves to explain the necessary lack or castration required for the subject to enter the symbolic realm.
The world of language, law, social recognition.
So if the Oedipus complex is imaginary, that should free up the whole discussion about the nature of desire itself.
It should have.
But if Lacan dismissed the myth, why do D&G still see him as a failure on this point? That seems like a really positive, demythologizing move.
It was a massive philosophical missed opportunity. Because immediately after dismissing Freud's version as mythical, Lacan committed the same essential error.
How?
He defined this imaginary Oedipus complex as necessary to designate the real position of the subject within the symbolic structure.
Okay, so instead of a mythical necessity tied to history.
It became a structural necessity tied to language.
I see.
He developed this structural account of desire that was supposedly abstracted from history, but it maintained the exact same repressive function.
The Oedipal triangle was just replaced by the abstract triad of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real.
But the subject still had to pass through a structural lack castration enforced by the name of the father, the law, to achieve personhood. The structure itself became the prison.
And that's where they use that fantastic, dark analogy.
The one about the resistance fighters.
Yeah. They said Lacan's critique was like resistance fighters who balanced the plastic charges so well that the pylon blew up and fell back into its hole.
It's brutal. He destroyed the mythical Oedipus only to create a structural one. He reimposed the entire Oedipal system, but now with this structuralist rigidity. The underlying repressive function remained completely intact.
So whether it's a mythical story or a structural law, the moment desire gets captured by this yoke of Oedipus, it's forced to appear as this a historical, eternal mirror of human nature.
And that means desire can only be understood through the lens of repression and lack. Always lack.
And this is where the political imperative for them really emerges. D&G insist the fundamental logic has to be reversed.
Completely. Unconscious desire is inherently inedible. It is only captured and constrained by the family structure under specific historical and economic conditions.
Specifically capitalism, which needs repetitive, guilt-ridden subjects to function.
The unconscious, in their revolutionary view, is never lacking. It's never defined by the father's law. It is defined by pure material production, and it is just waiting to be liberated by understanding its own internal machinic logic.
Okay, so if we accept that premise that desire is production, then we have to understand what this productive unconscious actually looks like. It's time to head into the engine room. So, if the unconscious isn't a repetitive theater of repression, what is it? D&G have to provide a positive theory.
They do. A theory of the unconscious that is neither a stage for drama nor, as Lacan suggested, a structural void defined by lack.
And this moves us into the heart of their philosophy, defining desiring production.
They achieve this by radically shifting the ontological ground, how they define fundamental reality. They do it by introducing their core operational binary.
And that is?
Structure versus machine.
Okay, let's pause there because these terms are loaded. When you say structure, what are they rejecting?
They're rejecting the structuralist tendency, which was very popular at the time, to see reality as defined by mutual reference.
Like language. The meaning of a word is only defined by its relation to all the other words in the system.
Exactly. Structure is always defined by an internal logic of mutual dependency. It's a closed system.
And the machine.
The machine is the opposite. This builds on Guattari's earlier work in institutional analysis. The machine functions outside of that closed structure. It's a dynamic system of flows and cuts that actually precedes the structure and plays a role in its genesis.
So desire, then, is machinic and structural.
Yes. It is logically prior to the structure it eventually creates. Desire isn't like a language. It's the flow that produces the conditions for language, the conditions of the family, the conditions for capital.
This is a huge shift from Deleuze's earlier philosophical work, right, which often required some kind of external structuring template.
A virtual idea, yes, to give actual experience its form. Now, the virtual idea is deemed unnecessary.
Why?
Because the intensive field of individuation itself is capable of directing its own actualization.
And this field of individuation gets renamed.
It does, to the multiplicity of desiring production. And the self-directed processes within this field are the desiring machines.
This is why their definition is recursive. It loops back on itself.
Desiring production is production of production. It doesn't need an external master plan or an external intention or an external template to tell it what to build.
It builds itself. It constantly differentiates itself, and its output is the input for the next machine. It's a process that is self-referential in its productivity.
And this completely reorients the role of the Oedipus complex.
It's no longer the cause, the template that determines desire.
It's merely a secondary and often crippling effect. They write that it is Oedipus that depends on desiring production. And it is the Oedipus complex that is virtual.
So it exists as a potential representation, but it has no actual existence or necessity in defining desire itself.
And if you follow that logic, the entire task of analysis changes. It is no longer about fitting the messy reality of desiring machines into the restricted code of Oedipus.
It's about understanding the flows of desire that escape the virtual Oedipus.
Because those escapes are what show desire's true, positive, productive foundation.
To really get our heads around this machinic nature, we need to clarify what D&G are rejecting in terms of, traditional science.
Right. They dismiss two primary models for understanding reality.
The first one is?
First, they reject mechanistic theories. So the classical physics approach that explains reality as combinations of inert, distinct, pre-existing elements distributed in space.
Like billiard balls.
Exactly. These theories, D&G argue, fail to explain genesis. They can't explain how anything new was actually created.
And the second thing they reject?
They reject traditional vitalism. The idea of a life force or a teleological, goal-oriented force that runs through what is otherwise inert matter.
That just replaces one mystery with another.
It does. They overcome both of these problems by introducing the concept of intensive matter.
This is the crucial ontological move.
It is. Matter, for D&G, is not made of distinct units distributed in a pre-given space. It is nothing other than a field of intensities, a constantly shifting field of difference.
That's a little hard to grasp. How is matter intensive?
Well, think about temperature or pressure. Those are intensive qualities. They aren't measured by size or quantity. They're measured by their potential and their level of differentiation.
So matter in this sense is energy, tendency, and potential differentiation.
Yes. And if matter is this field of intensity, then desiring machines operate fundamentally differently than traditional mechanisms. They don't operate within the structures of pre-given time and space, like a traditional clock.
They produce those structural effects, the feeling of time, the layout of space. Those are outputs.
Exactly. Desire is the material drive of intensity that's always oriented outside of itself. And that drive produces the actual measurable relations of bodies in space and time.
And this is where the dynamic element comes in. Unlike a traditional machine, which seeks equilibrium,
Which functions by maintaining a steady, repeating state.
desiring machines function by continually breaking down.
They run only when they are not functioning properly.
They function through malfunction. I mean, that's a truly revolutionary idea.
It's the drive toward difference. If a machine were to achieve perfect stasis, perfect function, it would stop producing anything new.
It would just repeat.
Instead, the constant breakdown drives them towards mutation, reassembly, transformation. And that constant drive is what generates history, the new, the differentiated, instead of just repeating the same old cycle.
We can characterize this through flows and breaks. That's a key concept for them.
Correct. Every desiring machine functions as a break in the flow in relation to the machine it's connected to.
For instance, the mouth machine is a break on the flow of milk from the breast machine.
But at the same time, that mouth machine is a flow itself, preparing to connect with the stomach machine.
So flows are only cut by other flows. There's no external moderator, no central control tower, no governing law.
And what is flowing? Unconscious desire. Understood not as a repressed fantasy, but as a material intensive force that is constantly connecting, cutting, and reconnecting.
It's an engine that has to be constantly moving.
And it builds the world as it moves.
Okay, now that we have the engine, we need the manual. We need to understand how this self-regulating material unconscious actually works.
So to explain how this material intensive unconscious actually operates, D&G offer what they call a transcendental account.
All right, let's clarify that jargon immediately. When they say transcendental account, they don't mean something supernatural, do they?
No, not at all. They mean something closer to Kant. They're defining the conditions of possibility for experience.
Okay.
So they're defining the inner operating logic of desire, the rules it follows to connect and produce, rather than imposing external structural conditions.
And they define 3 operational laws, or syntheses.
And they show how the illegitimate use of these syntheses leads directly to the Oedipal trap.
And we can't really discuss these syntheses without introducing one of the most famously obscure concepts in the whole book.
The body without organs. The BWO.
Right.
The BWO, it's a term they borrowed from the poet Antonin Artaud. It's the unformed, unorganized state of the body. Pure matter without a specific assigned form or expression.
You can think of it as pure potential. Or maybe like a massive, unformatted hard drive.
I like that. An unformatted hard drive. It exists, but it has no programs, no structure, no data yet. It represents the pole of absolute disorganization or non-productive stasis.
So the desiring machines are perpetually working against the BWO, differentiating it, carving structure out of that potential.
Exactly. The genesis of the machines and the BWO are concurrent. They're driven by the tension between the productive differentiating process of the machines and this threat of absolute non-productive uniformity, the absolute indeterminacy of the BWO.
Okay, so let's look at the 3 laws of production.
We start with synthesis 1, connective synthesis of production. They summarize this with the additive function, the and.
This synthesis just describes how desiring machines link up to one another.
It builds on Freud's initial idea of libidinal investment, but it strips away the Freudian teleology, the goal towards reproduction or neurosis.
So what's the rule for the legitimate use of this synthesis?
The key is that connections are transversal, and they occur between heterogeneous and partial elements.
They use the classic example. The child's mouth, a sucking machine, coupling to the breast, a milk-producing machine.
And the legitimate use insists we must recognize that the connection is transversal and additive. The mouth and the breast and the flow of milk, and then the resulting sensation.
So the illegitimate use, the Oedipal illusion, would be to assume that those elements, mouth, breast, milk, actually precede the connection itself.
Yes, that's what they call the transcendental illusion. The illusion is to retrospectively organize these disparate parts into a neat, pre-given whole, the mother, the child, the family unit.
When the machinic use is purely additive, it's always and then.
It's constant formation and reformation of connections. And this creates these primitive chains of code that are constantly battling the Beethoven's threat of absolute indeterminacy.
So the connections happen first, and the elements are just defined by the connection. Got it. This flow of production is immediately followed by synthesis too. Disjunctive synthesis of recording. They call it the grid.
This is how unconscious memory or recording gets created. Machines detach themselves to make new connections. The mouth detaches from the breast to connect to the hand, or a stone, or the father's voice.
And this process of disconnection and new connection leaves traces on the BWO.
Like scars, it marks the surface off into a grid or coordinates.
This recording process is essential because it allows the unconscious to organize itself. But this is where we get the most crucial philosophical distinction in the entire book.
The difference between the two uses of this synthesis.
Inclusive versus exclusive disjunction.
This is the operational core of their entire critique of psychoanalysis. The illegitimate or Oedipal neurotic use treats these disjunctions as exclusive, as either.
If the machine disconnects from the mother, it must connect to the father, or society, or the law.
It projects opposition onto a pre-individual process.
Which seems like common sense in Western thought, doesn't it? Everything is defined by what it is not. If I choose A, I exclude B.
Precisely. But D and G argue this exclusive binary choice is what traps desire. This forcing of opposition is what creates the binary split that psychoanalysis recognizes. The actualized neurotic versus the foreclosed psychotic.
You have to choose one option, and whatever you choose, you are fundamentally defined by the exclusion of the other option.
Yes. So what does the legitimate use look like?
It's the schizophrenic process.
It is, which affirms alternatives through inclusive disjunction, either or. Because the connections are transversal and heterogeneous, the breaks are productive. They lead to multiple parallel reassemblies.
So disjunctions don't involve negation or lack. They involve positive difference and addition.
Give me a real-world analogy for that difference.
Okay, think about a highly codified, organized bureaucracy. If you're told you must apply for either permit A or permit B, that's exclusive disjunction. Choosing A makes B impossible. Now, imagine a chaotic, decentralized network like an internet rumor flow or a grassroots activist movement. Information doesn't just choose one path.
It moves across multiple parallel channels simultaneously. It's permit A and maybe a completely different route C and a new route D that nobody anticipated.
That inclusive disjunction means breaks aren't denials. They are new, simultaneous opportunities for connections. And that inclusive logic is what makes the unconscious flow a signifying.
Correct. The semiotics of this schizophrenic recording process are signifying. They function like genetic code or computer code. They articulate themselves and produce effects without referring to an external signified or meaning.
It's machines speaking to other machines, not symbols speaking to an interpretation.
The code is only capable of generating difference, not defining meaning. This positive additive view of difference fundamentally collapses the entire Oedipal logic.
Because if difference is positive, you are not defined by the lack of the father or the mother. You're defined by the potential of the next transversal connection.
Which brings us to the final stage, synthesis 3, conjunctive synthesis of consumption consummation. This is about the production of the subject.
So how does the subject, the I, emerge from all these flows?
The first two syntheses produce what D&G call intensive quantities, pure sensations and flows. These quantities have to be consumed by what they call personages, which aren't yet true, stable individuals.
The subject is merely an effect of these intensive states, a mere residuum, a leftover.
It's not the owner or the initiator of the process. The subject is constituted by being driven by these flows.
So the I comes last. It's an after-image of the process.
Precisely. The flow happens, the recording happens, and then the sensation of that flow hits a personage who experiences the intensive quantities, the pure pain, the pure joy, the pure connection, and says, I felt that.
And this is the final moment of the Oedipal illusion.
Yes. The illegitimate use occurs when the subject, which was produced as an after effect, places itself before the process of individuation.
And retrospectively projects its own image back as the original producer.
It's the moment of recognition, so that's what it was, moment, where the subject claims ownership and governance over a process that actually created it.
And this illegitimate appropriation produces an organized body, what we traditionally call the organism, where each organ or element has a fixed, specific role, and change is impossible outside of that Oedipal structure.
It's a body imprisoned by its own image. whereas the legitimate use, the constant production of the BWO, produces a productive BWO, a site of becoming in constant transformation.
The neurotic is trapped in the organized body. The schizophrenic process is the body perpetually trying to reorganize itself.
It's really astonishing how D&G argue that the entire psychoanalytic project systematically misrepresents all three syntheses, from connection to recording to consumption, just to enforce this exclusive binary choice that leads to neurosis or psychosis.
By placing the conjunction of the subject after the disjunction of recording, they're basically saying the unconscious can code and articulate itself through its own ace-signifying semiotics before the subject even exists to observe it.
The machinic unconscious isn't chaos. It's pure, productive logic that we simply misrepresent when we try to interpret it through the narrow, familial lens of lack.
Okay, so if the unconscious is a productive factory of code regulated by these three syntheses, we can now finally define the concept that makes political and personal transformation possible.
The line of flight.
The positive result of the schizophrenic process.
That's right. D&G championed the schizophrenic process, the immanent functioning of the unconscious, where all disjunctions are inclusive and connections are transversal.
But they are very careful to critique the schizophrenic patient.
Very careful. They see the patient as a victim. The patient's loss of reality is not the effect of the schizophrenic process, they write, but the effect of its forced adipolization.
The process is positive and creative. The patient is its tragically captured victim.
So if the unconscious is constantly writing, decoding, and recoding itself through these transversal connections and inclusive disjunctions, how does the line of flight actually manifest?
This is definition 1, the functional role.
It's about escape. The French word is fuite. When a partial element, an energy, a sensation, an intense flow escapes one codified chain.
To connect transversely with a completely different heterogeneous chain.
And that disjunction is inclusive, meaning it affirms both paths.
The original chain loses its function as a fixed code.
It becomes a chain of escape, or a line of flight.
So the line of flight is an active process of decoding and deterritorialization. It's what resists the codes from becoming permanently ingrained.
Exactly. Its role is to create constant transformations and mutations in the code. It is what allows desire to continually differ from itself, moving from a static, rigid organization, a territory like the nuclear family, to a dynamic, decoded flow.
This is the source of all genuinely historical change.
Let's put this back in terms of the political ferment of 1968.
Okay.
The Marxist political codes and the French Communist Party codes were highly territorialized. They were rigidly defined structures.
The student desire that erupted was a massive collective line of flight, a spontaneous connection between workers and students, between politics and aesthetics, that just bypassed and decoded all the established political paths.
It was pure positive difference exploding onto the social body. And that leads directly to definition 2, the methodological role.
Which defines how one studies this process.
If you're an analyst, what are you supposed to look for?
Well, traditional psychoanalysis, both Freudian and Lacanian, focuses on lines of pressure.
The evidence of repression, the blockage, the anxiety that shows where the structure is holding firm.
But schizoanalysis shifts the entire focus.
It must follow the lines of escape, lead to food, and the machinic indices all the way to the desiring machines.
That's a radical shift in methodology. You look for the escape instead of the trap.
Because the machinic unconscious is a continuous multiplicity, but our language and our perceptions can only represent it structurally as a discrete multiplicity, a fixed linear image.
So the analyst has to look for what escapes this structural capture, the anomalies, the excesses, the slips, the creative forces that just refuse the Oedipal narrative.
The line of flight becomes a practical tool for mapping desire, not as a reflection of lack, but as the engine of production. It's the reverse side of the structure that Lacan discovered but then refused to follow.
Lacan saw the boundaries of his structural system and called them lack.
And D&G see the same boundaries and say, no, that boundary is the pressure point where the desire is escaping. The reverse side is made up of pure positive multiplicities where everything is possible without exclusiveness or negation.
This brings us to the big aha moment payoff and our return to Lacan. We can use the analogy of linear perspective here.
Good one. Linear perspective captures space in an organized, regular way. It's a representation.
But it buries the intensive nature of depth, or what D&G would call the continuous flow of matter.
And the Oedipal structure is like linear perspective. It uses the familial relationship as the transcendent measuring rod to judge all others. It reduces the infinite variation of desire to a single ordered expression.
And this is where we link back to Lacan's objet petit.
The constantly retreating, lost object of desire.
The object petit is often seen as the vanishing point, the point de fuite, in the structural organization of desire.
It's the spot in the distance where parallel lines escape the plane to meet at infinity. It gives the illusion of depth and closure.
Lacan argued that this vanishing point is an empty gap, a structural invariant of lack, the lost object you can never retrieve.
And he insisted this lack is necessary for human subjectivity.
But D&G fundamentally reject this interpretation.
They argue we have to recognize that the vanishing point is not an empty lack. It's an indication of the beyond. It's a sign of excess in production, not failure in absence.
We have to follow the line of flight drawn by this desire to reach the real, intensive, positive, and productive unconscious.
The vanishing point is merely the visible sign, the structural index, that we are dealing with a heterogeneous interconnection of productive parts that are operating outside the linear structure.
So the lines of flight are those schizophrenic processes, the additive connections, the inclusive disjunctions that create mutations in the code by making transversal links,
Which allows us to decode and deterritorialize the flows of the unconscious.
moving us collectively from the static, repeating Oedipal theater to the productive, differentiating factory. The line of flight is the mechanism of genuine becoming, allowing us to escape the social codes that tell us who we are, what we desire, and where we belong.
We've taken a deep and challenging journey into the philosophy of transformation.
We certainly have.
We followed Deleuze and Guattari as they moved desire from a repetitive, familial Oedipal theater to a productive, schizoid factory powered by desiring machines and their lines of flight.
The core logic, the fundamental intellectual breakthrough is this. Desire is not defined by lack. It's not defined by repression or a necessary structural triangle. It is defined by its positive, intensive, and a signifying productivity.
And the structure of the family, the neurosis, the Oedipal complex, these are all secondary, retrospective representations of that underlying material production.
This definition of desire as the driving creative force of differentiation is why the line of flight is so vital. It's the concept that allows desire to resist capture.
And it enables political and personal transformation, demonstrating that the potential for change is already embedded in the material reality of the unconscious.
And here is the mic drop quote, the affirmation that really sums up this entire perspective on difference and becoming.
Desiring production is pure multiplicity. That is to say, an affirmation that is irreducible to any sort of unity.
So if desire is this driving creative force of differentiation, this energy pushing against the constraints of structure, and if our social codes and structures are built on the lie that desire is rooted in lack and family drama,
then we leave you with this final provocative thought.
think about your daily routines, your professional life, your consumption habits. Where is the code strongest and where is it weakest?
What everyday, seemingly mundane activity in your life, a new, non-traditional hobby you picked up, a relationship formed outside of conventional social lines, a way you use technology that subverts its intended purpose, is actually a line of flight.
What small transversal connections are you making that are decoding the established routines of your own personal code?
And pointing toward a future that is defined by positive difference rather than structural repetition.
That's the challenge D&G layout.
We've been decoding all along. Thank you for diving deep with us.